peace and prosperity. So, reining in spending isn't a one-time proposition. We're going to have to do that continuously and repeatedly. We had the first reduction in spending year over year when we did the debt ceiling deal, which was a bipartisan endeavor, and we need to continue to do things like that. So I'm going to hammer away or sound the alarm, as we say, to the fact that interests have now exceeded Medicare and defense, and will be close to $1 trillion just to service the debt in our country. I'm going to focus on the Republican side first, sort of get my family's house in order and make sure that we are steeled in our nerves and in our political will to do the difficult tasks that are ahead of us. And I haven't seen that political will from either party, quite frankly. Each have their own philosophical approach to debt, but both have contributed to this unsustainable spending and debt path that we're on. We're going to continue also, Bob, to find ways to reform the current budget process. We celebrated, I should say, celebrated may be too much of an exaggeration of what we do with the 1974 Budget Act, because in the recent past, it hasn't worked. Neither party has put forward the kind of effort to pass a budget, to enforce the budgets, et cetera. So we're looking for bipartisan ways to put the incentives into place and the enforcement mechanisms that will force Congress, both sides of the aisle, to do what the American people have to do and what states and local governments and businesses have to do, which is to develop a budget, live by that budget, and live within your means. It's sad that that's a novel concept for Washington, but that's where we are.
Now, I've been covering Congress since the mid to late 1990s, and even though that was a long time ago, it's amazing that we've amassed so much debt in such a short amount of time. We actually had a surplus about 25 years ago. One of your big priorities is a bipartisan debt commission. And listen, I've covered a lot of committees, and I've seen a lot of bipartisanship on committees like the Science Committee or maybe Agriculture. But you actually have had bipartisanship on the budget panel, and I've rarely seen that. Can you talk about the Bipartisan Debt Commission, what it would do, and how you attracted some bipartisanship on it?
Well, it starts with a good wingman, and my Democrat ranking member, Brendan Boyle from Pennsylvania, has been a willing partner to set the right tone. We try to debate the facts and the different policy approaches to addressing our fiscal challenges. We actually started the Budget Committee in this Congress with a fiscal state of the nation. And the objective, Bob, was very simple: to get consensus, get agreement across the aisle and across the political spectrum that, number one, both parties have contributed to this recklessness and unsustainable path, but two, that this path is not only unsustainable, but it's getting exponentially worse, as we described earlier. By the way, the annual deficit will double, according to CB, over the next 10 years. Interest will more than double, and we'll spend 62 cents on every dollar we borrow over the next 10 years. And we're borrowing $100,000 a second, $8 billion a day. The wheels are coming off. And our first job was just to have agreement around the math, and that we had to do something, and we have to do something to intervene, or really bad things will happen to our economy, to our security, and to America's future. And we were able to achieve that. But again, I give my ranking member a lot of credit. He has helped set the right tone. We've had very healthy, robust debate and discourse. And I've gotten a commitment from my ranking member that the process is broken. All you have to do is look at the outcomes. We need to reconfigure these incentives, strengthen the enforcements. And as a result, Bob, we've had, I think, 10 roughly bipartisan budget process reform initiatives passed out of committee. This is a committee, as you said, has traditionally been a shirts and skins, very partisan dynamic. And here we have, it's been over a decade since we've passed any bipartisan legislation, but we've got 10 reforms. And one of them, as you mentioned, is this bipartisan debt commission, similar to Simpson-Bowles, but learning from past commissions where we can strengthen our chances of success. And what is success? Success would be consensus from the two parties on how to address our $140 trillion in unfunded liability out into the 30-year future for this country, to deal with the insolvency crisis on Medicare and Social Security, and just overall strengthen our balance sheet and bring that debt to GDP down. I was proud that we got Democrats and Republicans to pass it. Now our big challenge is to get it to the floor, get it to the president's desk, regardless of how things shake out this November, so that we can get thoughtful, serious people to come up with a plan so we can keep this country on its current global leadership path and give our children a fighting chance at the blessings of liberty and opportunity.
As you know, Washington is a town of push and pull. There's always people pushing for something and people pushing back. While there were a couple of Democrats who voted for this commission in committee, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was Congressman Panetta and Peters, two California Democrats, which is very interesting, who support it. And Panetta said it would have been easy to vote no on this, but he realizes how important this issue is. Was that the result of some long conversations with those members?
Earl Blumenauer from Oregon also voted with us.
Okay.
He's not coming back, but Mr. Blumenauer is a very thoughtful guy, a fellow Ways and Means member. Yeah, look, I'm not surprised. Scott Peters and Jimmy Panetta and myself, along with a number of other set of members, both Republican and Democrat, started a bipartisan caucus 3-4 years ago, just as we were entering into COVID. We all understood and appreciated the fact that we were going to be spending a boatload of money to get through this unprecedented time. But we thought while we were going to do that, and sort of acknowledging that we could parlay that with some fiscal responsibility and certainly a bipartisan mechanism to look out beyond COVID and say, look, when we get through this, we need something already in place where we can identify some key strategies on all sides of the ledger to start bringing down our debt to GDP and start reducing our runaway deficits. And by the way, and I think it's important to note that there's a lot of discussion about cutting things and revenue raising and the like. The deficit that is ever growing and almost at $2 trillion annually now, which will double over 10 years, is a deferred tax on our children. We don't get a free ride. We don't get to just print it out of thin air with no consequence. Generations of Americans today and yet born will bear the consequences of us not paying for the promises that we make, the programs we create. And that lack of cost benefit is an irrational system, and it's a dangerous one. And I'm just trying to call both sides together to say, we have to pay for the government that we are creating and promising. If we're not going to cut it, we've got to find a way to offset it, because it's unacceptable to load the wagon of our children, load them down with a debt they'll never be able to get out from. By the way, George Washington, in his farewell address, he reminded us of that and said, don't put a debt burden on future generations such that you are not willing to bear yourselves. Well, clearly, we have not been willing to bear it ourselves.
Mr. Chairman, can you respond to, I know in an event we co-hosted earlier this year, you took on Grover Norquist's criticisms of the legislation on this bipartisan looking at the debt. And he basically accused you of trying to stab Trump in the back and raise taxes. Now, I know you've said, hey, this is a spending problem, but I think both sides have to, in order to get a solution, especially in divided government, unless you've got overwhelming majorities in both the House and Senate, you're going to have to both parties come together. So everything's on the table, right?
That's right. I said that repeatedly, that everything's on the table. Listen, most Republicans, like myself, believe that the preponderance of our problem is an ever-growing government beyond the scope and mission that I think our framers, founders intended. And the Democrats, their preponderance of the problem characterization is one of both spending and revenue. Generally, it's taxes that they're talking about, although revenue is something we can also unpack because, quite frankly, you don't have to raise rates. You can keep rates low, keep your economy competitive, and still the tax code is riddled with loopholes and special interest credits and debits and other giveaways. So I think it is fair to put everything on the table. And yeah, there are some folks out there like Mr. Norquist's group. I think principally I agree. Keep tax rates low. Give Americans more of their hard-earned money back to invest in their future and their families, and keep America's economy and our job creators competitive. Before the Trump tax cuts, we had the highest corporate tax rates in the developed world. I know that's not right. Where it should be is, I think, a good subject for debate. We obviously have to pay for the government, but the government, in my opinion, is way too big and way too unruly. But these are the debates that Democrats and Republicans have to have, just like they did in the Greenspan Commission that preceded Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill. And Reagan was willing to say, I'll take 3 cuts or $3 in cut to every $1 in revenue, a revenue raise. And that was sort of the philosophical approach he took. And so I think if you're going to put our country first, and if you're going to solve these massive problems that are running away from us and that will be so destructive and even create irreparable harm to this republic, you got to cut through the forces in Washington, the swamp effect on both sides that have forever kept us in our respective corners, scaring us and our electorate that someone's doing a backdoor tax increase and someone's doing a backdoor cut to some program like Medicare. At the end of the day, I think most Americans understand and are willing to make the sacrifice to say, we got to put everything on the table. We have to look for our best options that do the least damage all the way around, but that put us on a path that give our kids a fighting chance. And that's where I am. And I think, quite frankly, most Republicans are there too. And I think most Democrats are there, and they tell me that privately. We just have to up our game in terms of the political courage that it's going to take that has always been there in every generation with world wars and Great Depressions. And we have to muster that courage now for what I think is the 21st century threat, our national debt.
Right, and that's been the debt has been cited by many experts as a national security problem. So how many Democrats do you think, if this bill hit the floor in the Debt Commission, you think you'd get?
That's a great question. I think a lot more than you saw coming out of committee, because I think the Democrat House leadership was sending the signal to not join this at that moment. Maybe they were going to use it as political leverage in the broader funding debate. But I think there's a lot more there. And I think if we can get the leadership to agree, and if we can get one of the presidential candidates to agree that the only way we're going to do the big things and solve the big problems related to the debt is to have both parties at the table and to have a solution that probably we will all not like a little bit,
right,
but will appreciate in its fullness the positive impact on the country. So I think you're going to get more than half of Democrats and Republicans at the end of the day, because I think we're at a different place than we were 10 years ago, 20 years ago. Things are pretty desperate. I think people are connecting the dots, Bob, whether it's with inflation and spending or the debt in general, which is crowding out private sector investment for growth, but it's also squeezing our priorities. And listen, whether your priorities are climate change or defense, you're not going to have the money to make the investment to have the impact to deal with our respective views on existential threats if we are in the tank financially. And that's, we're well on our way, unfortunately. So I think this should always be a bipartisan effort, because I think that's the only way it's going to resolve itself in terms of a meaningful plan.
Have you talked to Speaker Johnson or any other leader like Steve Scalise about scheduling a vote on this year?
You can bet your bottom dollar that I do that to a fault. I'm probably it can be a very annoying chairman of the budget committee.
Yes.
Because listen, I took this job because I know my members care about what's happening and like I said, the rapid deterioration of our fiscal health as a nation. And I'm a team player, but I took this job to run hard and run fast at this problem. And a lot of that running hard and fast is within my own party and my own colleagues, and especially with leadership. And there's a balance to doing this, and timing is important. But absolutely, I've encouraged the speaker and others to support this. In fact, the speaker supported me as I endeavored to have the debate and then the markup and vote on the Bipartisan Debt Commission. I can tell you that Speaker Mike Johnson is philosophically all for this. He understands, as well as anybody, that this sort of bipartisan construct is what will have to happen eventually to take on the big issues. And so I think it's a matter of timing. I don't think we got nearly the traction with Mr. Jeffries, but I think in time, Jimmy Panetta, Scott Peters, and there's a whole host of others, Jared Golden, and I could give you a list of I don't know, 20 plus Democrats who can help bring their leadership along. It's unnerving politically for both sides. As we said, there are calls for backdoor raising of taxes and stabbing people in the back. And you've got the other where people are saying you're going to throw grandmother off the cliff. We got to dispense with this silliness and swampiness. We got to be mature adult leaders for the greatest country in human history, and we got to care. And if we don't, we'll have the history books writing a very bad chapter about our generation of leaders and our inability to come together, make the sacrifices, do the right thing, and save the country.
And have you talked to former President Trump? Have you lobbied him on this bill, whether it be for this year or maybe next year if he becomes president again?
Yeah, I don't know that I'll dig in too deep into my private conversations with him, except to say that we have talked about this. We talked about this when he, in his last part of his first term, and I felt like the commitment was there. I think his focus was rebuilding the military, doing trade deals and restructuring, for example, the trade deal with our biggest partners, Mexico and Canada, which was a bipartisan effort, by the way, for what is now called USMCA. So there were a number of things, hitting reset with China and making sure we had fair and reciprocal trade. I think that it was appropriate, in my opinion, to lead with reigniting growth with pro-growth policies on deregulation, on a more competitive tax code, on opening up new markets for American trade and America First trade. I think that was a good foundation to pour from which to bring the debt to GDP down and strengthen our overall fiscal health. But now it's time to do the more difficult things when it comes to right-sizing our bloat post-COVID and to reform some of these mandatory programs that are unsustainable at this point. So I have talked to him since then, and I have not gone into great detail, but in our 10-year balanced budget, our reverse the curse blueprint for restoring fiscal responsibility. And I can tell you that without getting into details, I think I don't know of another politician in this business, Republican or Democrat, that once committed to something is as dogged and as courageous and as willing to take the risks as someone like President Trump. And so if we have a chance to do something meaningful, I think President Trump, and I know he's vilified for a lot of things, but remember, he was willing to sit down and and do a deal with respect to DACA, which was beyond where our party was comfortable. He was willing to do the deal and win the deal on USMCA, and on labor and environment, he went further than our party was comfortable. I think that President Trump would be the ideal leader because he is a deal maker and he's a very pragmatic guy when it comes to problem solving. So I'm hopeful in that way.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, you talked about political courage and it's difficult to deal with. In 1997, Congress passed the Balanced Budget Act of 97. I know you sit on the Ways and Means Committee, different era, but at that time there was a lot of fights between then Speaker Gingrich and then President Clinton, and yet they got that done. Part of the reason was because Medicare was going bankrupt. Well, now fast forward, and Medicare is going bankrupt again. I mean, there's a reality here that I'd like you to talk about. You talked about, entitlements, but I mean, these have to be addressed. I mean, the big issues are Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and defense. And Democrats can talk about tax cuts, and certainly you can raise some revenue that way. But can you talk about having the need to do that? And even back then, there was one vote against it in the Ways and Means Committee, and that actually reformed Medicare, but for the better, and it made Medicare more financially healthy. Congress is going to have to make these decisions at some point, right?
No question. And here's what I think the American people need to be reminded of, and maybe our own colleagues here in Washington, although I suspect they know this, but we don't talk about it enough. If we do nothing, whether it's on the programmatic reform side or the pay-for side on Social Security and Medicare, two of the most important safety net programs for our seniors, they will be cut automatically. I think Social Security is upwards of 20% automatic cut. That's unsustainable, especially with this current inflation that where we've had an increase in the cost of essential goods by about 20% over the last 3 years. These folks are mostly on a fixed income, and they're mostly in the middle and lower income spectrum. It's not sustainable, and I think it's a dereliction of responsibility for lawmakers and leaders of the greatest country in the world to just avoid these conversations. The conversations have to happen in order to find consensus, and then we make the tough decision. We fashioned that bipartisan commission, Bob, so that we had a pretty low threshold for getting expedited consideration on the floor, a low threshold of bipartisan consensus. We reduced the threshold to give it the biggest chance to get on the floor for an up or down vote, similar to the base realignment closure initiative, right? The BRAC process.
Right.
It was difficult to get anybody to right-size the military-industrial complex and our military assets, some of which were irrelevant and should be mothballed, and some of which needed greater investment. But nobody was going to make those decisions because we had that single-member district hat on. We couldn't look at the bigger picture and the bigger national interest. I think this bipartisan commission could serve like a BRAC, get this thing to the floor, and at that point, I think you're going to get the consensus and the votes you need to get it to the president's desk. I don't see a president, whether it's Biden or Trump, that would reject some compromise solution to saving those two programs. And Bob, each party can work on their strategy to reducing the deficit. Obviously, we laid out ours in our 10-year balanced budget. And you're right, it has some healthcare elements, welfare reform elements, and others focused on the mandatory spending programs, which are almost 80% of our entire budget. So when we talk about shutdowns, the American people think that we're debating the budget of the United States federal government. That's not so. It's only 20%, 20 to 25%.
Yep.
So we've got to take on that bigger piece and the longer unfunded liabilities. And I think each party can do their part modestly, but I think on the big stuff, especially Social Security and Medicare, where our seniors are already anxious about whether or not they're going to have the retirement security and health security, that's where we got to come together as Americans first, put the party stuff way down on the list, and get to solving the problem.
I want to talk about also the 2025 agenda. As I mentioned at the top, the Trump tax cuts are expiring next year. So that's going to be a big issue. We're going to have fiscal showdowns on a number of issues, possible government shutdowns, which always happen, in the debt ceiling. First question, before we get to the policy issues, Speaker Johnson not only thinks that Republicans can keep the House, but have a bigger majority, which would make his life a lot easier. Are you confident that House Republicans are going to keep the majority? A lot of experts say it's a jump ball at this time.
I think we will keep the majority. I think it will be a small margin, no matter how it shakes out. But we've been living with a one-member, now two-member margin. So you double that, you got 4. You triple it, and you got 6. I think we'll have anywhere. I think it'll be around 10. But irrespective of the margin, I think we keep the majority. I think the Senate is the bigger guarantee, if there is one in politics, that they will flip. And then I think Trump's got the momentum, but it's going to be a close race. I'd like to set this thing up, Bob, where no matter who gets in power, the commitment's there for what we talked about at a bipartisan level. But there has been a lot of talk about what the trifecta of unified Republican leadership would look like in this town and in terms of a policy agenda. And I think it's appropriate to discuss and debate what that agenda would be, because I think there's a pretty good to a good likelihood that that's the scenario that will be the outcome after November.
Mm-hmm. And do you, obviously it also all depends on what happens in November. You mentioned the Senate and the likelihood that the Senate is going to flip to Republicans, because Democrats they're just defending so many seats, and they're going to have to win every close race. But right. Are you confident one way or the other that the Trump tax cuts, by and large, are going to be extended, much like the Bush taxes were? There were some changes, yes, but they, by and large, were extended.
I think by and large, but you've got $4 trillion of cost, according to the Joint Committee on Taxation. That's the nonpartisan group that scores the cost of tax policy. And in this case, we're talking trillions of dollars in cost. Now, let me be clear. I've never said that tax cuts will pay for themselves in their entirety. I think certain tax cuts and tax reforms where you broaden the base and lower rates will generate positive economic feedback that will do what the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the Republican tax cuts, did in terms of bringing in record revenue. JCT and the Congressional Budget Office was off by $1 trillion in terms of the revenue that would be returned to the Treasury based on the growth that happened. So I look, how that will shake out in terms of the details, I think in large part, you want the low rates that we got that incentivized investment, growth, job creation, more GDP. One thing I say to a lot of audiences in terms of why growth is important to our indebtedness is that the CBO projects a 2% average growth rate over the 10-year budget window. Mm-hmm. Well, back when Clinton was in office and Newt Gingrich was the speaker, we had well over 3%. If we just have the policies in place, and I believe one set of policies is to have a low and fair and competitive tax rate, along with other things related to trade, related to labor, related to regulations and the like. When you do that, 1% over the 2% that CBO projects is $3 trillion in deficit reduction over that 10-year window. So growth is a big part of the consideration and the formula for strengthening our balance sheet and our fiscal health as a nation. But you can't avoid the spending side as well. And as I mentioned, I don't think all tax cuts are the same, and tax provision, tax reforms are the same. We need to recognize the positive feedback, or what they call dynamic scoring, but that's not to suggest that they pay for themselves entirely. And we cannot, as Republicans, who claim to have the mantle of fiscal responsibility, have any agenda that produces greater deficits in the out years. In fact, we need to be committed altogether to reducing deficits and doing it the right way, growing the economy and bending the spending curve so that we're growing faster than we're spending and borrowing, which is not the case today, hasn't been the case for a while.
Well, 2024, a big election year, but 2025 is a big budget year. Chairman Jody Arrington, thanks so much for joining us. I could talk for you for another hour. Didn't even get all my questions in, but thanks for joining us.
I'm practicing for the Senate. How'd my filibuster go? Pretty good?
I think pretty good. I'll give you an A.
Bob, thank you for your time, and I'm open anytime. This is a subject I'm very passionate about. But God bless and thank you.
Thanks so much. Thank you again, Congressman Arrington, for joining us. I am now joined by his counterpart, Congressman Brendan Boyle, ranking member of the Budget Committee and a Democrat from Pennsylvania. Welcome, Congressman.
Great to be with you.
Well, just as I start off with the chairman, I talked about his agenda for the rest of the year. Do want to get to what's going to happen in 2025, but as the top Democrat on the Budget Committee, what are you working on now at the committee level?
Well, you know, it is interesting. 2025, which I know we're going to talk about in a little bit, is going to be such a once-in-a-decade opportunity to impact tax and fiscal policy that actually, in order to prepare for that, some of what we're focusing on now on the Democratic side is doing the preparation work so we're ready to hit the ground running in January 2025. I've been convening a number of meetings and sort of informational, educational roundtables for my Democratic colleagues on the committee to talk about all that will be expiring as set by law come 2025. It really will be, again, a once-in-a-decade opportunity. So the work for that doesn't begin in 2025. It actually, a bit of it begins right now. In addition to that, however, I've really been focusing on my time on attempting to get the word out about how strong this economy is, just how we have really kind of led the field by a great deal when you look at U.S. economic growth compared to all of our peer nations in the West. When you compare the fact that inflation is far lower in the U.S. than, again, all of our peers. What is it about the U.S. economy that has made it by far number one in the world? And that gap between us and everyone else is actually accelerating it. So I think it's important to understand what brought that about. It didn't happen by accident. And what lessons can we learn that then can be applied for the conversations that are happening about 2025 and the rest of the next decade?
Well, let's break that down a little bit because, as you mentioned, there are some very good indicators, whether that's unemployment, the stock market as well, even though I know that's not a key indicator of everybody's well-offness. But why is this disconnect between the economy and some of the signs and polls showing that people are just not feeling it? What's your take on that?
Yeah, so first, it's not totally uncommon, this disconnect. We've seen in past economic recoveries that public mood tends to be a bit of a lagging indicator, that it takes a while for it to kind of seep in. I also think, though, that we have to take a step back and realize this is not just a U.S. phenomenon. That if you look at Canada, UK, France, Germany, et cetera, we see a lot of discontent out there, and we have to recognize it. And we can't, tell people how to feel. They're going to feel based on their own life's experiences. And I think that, when you look at all those countries I just mentioned, some of them have left-of-center governments, some of them have right-of-center governments, but all of them experienced the same thing, and that was the once-in-a-century pandemic. I do think that we have been in essentially a low-grade depression. Not an economic depression, but a more general one in terms of mood, really since the spring of 2020. Here in the United States, we have 1.5 million fewer Americans than we did back then because of people we lost to the pandemic. So I think that we need to acknowledge we all went through a very traumatic time. And so it's understandable that people wouldn't necessarily be in a party mood so quickly after what was, for many of us, perhaps the most difficult thing we'll ever experience.
Now, obviously, it's better to be in the majority than in the minority. You're in the minority now, but just barely. Are you confident that Democrats can win the House? Because as you know, the White House is a jump ball. Trump is ahead, but it's a jump ball. The Senate's looking more Republican just based on the map. What's your take on the House and the chances Democrats can regain the majority?
I feel good about it. Look, it's my observation that this is really the first election since the year 2000 in which you genuinely have the House, Senate, and White House, all three up for grabs.
Yep.
Now, in terms of, both chambers of Congress, the way I describe it is while both are up for grabs, I would say perhaps the Senate is playing on the home field of the Republicans, while the House is playing on the home field of Democrats. And certainly geographically, you can look at that where a lot of the seats that will determine which party is in the majority are in blue states and blue districts when you're talking about the House races, the most competitive ones. Whereas, when it's the Senate, the seats and the states that will really determine which party controls the Senate, they tend to be more red than blue, such as Ohio and Montana, et cetera, and then a group of purple ones. So I have to say, as I sit here right now, 5 months ago, a lot can happen. Either side can win, but I would much rather be the Democratic side when it comes to control of the House than the Republican side.
When I was talking to Congressman Arrington, I was mentioning of how it's the Budget Committee is usually a very partisan committee, but the two of you really get along. Can you talk about your relationship with the chairman and how it's evolved?
Yeah, I've been friends with Jody for quite a number of years now. In fact, last year, I guess 2 years ago, when we were both seeking to lead our respective caucuses on the committee, I remember saying to him in the well of the House, "Boy, wouldn't this be amazing if we both got this and we could serve alongside each other as counterparts?" So he is a genuine friend. I feel fortunate that he's in that position. I would prefer him to be ranking member and for me to be chair, but I am very fortunate that he is the lead Republican on the committee. We have a good, genuine friendship and have worked constructively. We do not always agree. In fact, I would say he's a principled West Texas conservative, and I'm a principled Pennsylvania Democrat. So we come from the two major different ideological traditions, and yet we've been able to work together, and we do genuinely like each other. I hope that from the first day, we've set a tone that has led the committee to work in a mutually respectful way. And I have to say, it has been, personally gratifying that I've had members, both Democratic and Republican members, come up to me and say that they have appreciated the way that Jody and I have worked together and how that tone has really followed through in terms of, how the committee has acted for the last year and a half.
Yeah, and I think those are the stories that don't get out. There actually are bipartisan
Absolutely.
relationships in these
Yeah.
polarizing times. When I was talking to the chairman, as you know, he's pushing a fiscal commission on debt that has moved out of the budget panel. Did get a couple Democratic votes. I know you didn't vote for that, but what is your solution if you were to be chairman of getting our fiscal house in order and balancing the budget?
Yeah, I did vote against it, but as I said during those hearings, the root of my opposition wasn't that I, was wildly opposed to the idea or think it's so awful. It's that the commission is essentially an unnecessary detour. Because even if you have a commission, the same way you had a couple commissions about 10, 15 years ago, it still comes back to the actual members of Congress who will have to put up the vote and make some pretty tough decisions. I would rather just get to that point and not go through an unnecessary detour. I am also legitimately, genuinely concerned that a commission can essentially just be a ruse for attempting to enforce pretty substantial, devastating cuts to Social Security and Medicare, but do it in a sort of less obvious backdoor way. So those were the reasons for my opposition. But to be clear, when it comes to Social Security, when it comes to Medicare, both of which will, if nothing else happens, will go insolvent in about a decade. We also have deficits and debts that are projected to rise. So I recognize that we do have real challenges, not today, not tomorrow, but in the relatively near future that we need to deal with. I just think in the end of the day, it's going to be members who are going to have to solve those problems, not an independent commission.
Do you think when you talk about the debt, and it's amazing of how much the debt has piled up? Certainly, you mentioned COVID, and that was part of it. A lot of legislation, both bipartisan and partisan, but that has really escalated the debt. Do you think Republicans are going to be willing? Because as you mentioned, these programs need to be fixed. They need to be revamped in some capacity. Do you think the modern day Republican Party is going to agree to raising taxes? As you know, Grover Norquist attacked the chairman for this debt commission, thinking, hey, this is just a way to raise taxes.
Well, a couple thoughts on this. First, I'm always very careful to make this point because I think there's a lot of confusion in the public. Social Security does not add one dime to our deficit or our federal debt. In fact, for a lot of years, Social Security actually kind of masked the size of the deficit we had because it always brought in more people were paying into it than outlays, or essentially monthly checks were going out. When it comes to Medicare and Medicaid obviously funded a little bit differently. But for Medicare, it's basically the same philosophy as well. When we're talking about our deficit and our debt, those are separate conversations from whether or not Social Security or Medicare will have enough revenue after the year 2034 to meet the rise in the population of retirees that will begin right around that time. Now, in terms of where the Republican Party is on the conversation of revenues, I'm glad that this question is raised because I go to great lengths to always bring this up during our hearings whenever there's a conversation about deficit and debt. We've had testimony in a number of hearings that have taken place this term of Congress that when we look at $34 trillion of debt, 10 trillion of that is missing tax revenue just from the year 2001 on. Because we had the George W. Bush tax cuts of 2001, which weren't paid for, the George W. Bush second round of tax cuts in 2003 that weren't paid for, the extension of many of those tax cuts about a decade later, combined with then the Trump tax cuts, most of which went to the richest 1% in 2017. When you add that up, again, we have had experts testify before the committee that all told, that's about $10 trillion of revenue that we would have had if we had done nothing, as opposed to those tax cuts that I just mentioned. So let's make sure we remember there are two sides of the spreadsheet. Yes, there is the spending side, but there's also the revenue side. And we are far lower today in revenues than we would have been had we not taken those actions. And then finally, I'll say in terms of where the Republican Party is, I give Jody a lot of credit for being intellectually honest and saying that, I'm going to paraphrase him, but he has said that for him, everything has to be on the table, and that includes revenues. I think 10 years ago, that wouldn't have been a tenable position within the Republican Party, which was very much about the Tea Party and the Grover Norquist pledge about not raising taxes. The Republican Party today, frankly, is much more about the social and cultural issues than it is about fiscal issues. I think that's one of many ways that Trump has changed the party. So ironically, while there are many things Trump has brought about that I'm quite concerned about and really oppose, ironically, I think the Trumpification of the Republican Party and making it about all of those cultural issues has probably created a little bit more space for flexibility for Republicans today when it comes to fiscal policy.
Yeah, and then that sets up the next question. As you know, and you've been working on preparing for next year, the Trump tax cuts do expire. If you are chairman, what do you think Democrats should do, and what should Democrats learn from the extensions that you mentioned, on the Bush tax cuts going forward? Because if you are chairman, Democrats could have everything, but they've got to win every close Senate race. But more likely, it would probably be divided government. So how would that work?
Yeah, so first, I mean, we talked earlier about how the House, both sides could win it, the Senate, both sides could win it, the White House is a jump ball as well. So, boy, we're talking about literally 6 different scenarios there, or I think actually 8, if I'm doing the math right, different permutations in terms
Right.
of what things could look like after November. You really need to know the answer to that question first before you can kind of talk about what will likely happen in 2025. I will be making the argument that we do need more tax revenues, that the so-called Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was so heavily tilted to the richest 1%. It is the only tax cut, I believe, in the history of polling that had a higher disapproval rating than approval rating. That's pretty remarkable. Every previous tax cut, whether it was Ronald Reagan's or George W. Bush's, they were, more popular than unpopular. Not the TCJA, not the Trump tax cut. So making sure that we recognize that we do need more revenues. Also, what I will be looking at is, there were things that we passed out in the House in 2021 that then were not adopted by the Senate. I'll give you one example. The expansion of the child tax credit to help working poor families. That reduced child poverty for 1 year in the United States, because it only existed for 1 year, that expansion. It reduced child poverty by 46%. Just think about that. One piece of legislation, one policy change can reduce child poverty in the United States of America by almost half. That is something I feel very strongly about doing it. I think it's a tragedy that we didn't make it permanent when we had the opportunity. Revisiting that will be a major priority for me. I come from a district in which many people would be classified as the working poor. I come from a working class background myself. I'm pretty representative of the folks who I represent in Philly. And boy, so many people in my neighborhood would benefit from doing that. I also think that you're going to see the conversation again come back to what we need and can do on childcare. That was something that was passed out of the House, but unfortunately was not passed the Senate. So I think it'll be a combination of looking at what things that were bipartisan or can be bipartisan that were in the TCJA and that perhaps could be somehow saved, what things need to go, especially those things that really cost a lot of tax revenue. And then can we use some of that to make critical investments that as a country we currently are not making?
You mentioned your district. I'm interested in what your constituents are saying that maybe the White House could learn from. Obviously, the top of the ticket is so important. Pennsylvania, both for House and a big Senate race. And obviously the presidentials, probably whoever wins Pennsylvania is likely to win. What would you like to see the White House maybe do more of or accentuate?
So first, I am obviously a very biased individual when it comes to a conversation about Pennsylvania. But even taking that hat off, I can say quite confidently, Pennsylvania is the most important battleground state in the election. We are the largest, if you accept that, and I do, and I think most people do, that really the 6 biggest battleground states are the 3 in the north, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and the 3 in the Sun Belt, Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada. Pennsylvania is the biggest of the 6, and it's very hard to come up with a credible math that gets you to 270 for either candidate that doesn't include Pennsylvania's 19 electoral votes. So with that in mind, I have been very proud of the fact that this president has visited Pennsylvania more than any other president in my lifetime. It's almost a running joke among my colleagues when they see, I will get texts from colleagues, oh my goodness, Biden is back in your district again. Politico has reported that actually, besides Delaware, President Biden has visited my district more than any other district in the country. So, in 2016, if you remember, Hillary Clinton was, fairly or not, was faulted for not going to Wisconsin and not going as often to Michigan and Pennsylvania. No one can fault this president and this White House. He has paid attention to Pennsylvania incredibly more than, as I said, any other previous president in my lifetime. So I think continuing, as he's been doing, to show up, continuing to focus on middle-class economics and blue-collar economics, reminding people, because, we're in a very fractured media environment. And polls continue to show that, believe it or not, people don't necessarily know about what the bipartisan infrastructure bill did, what we did in 2021 in terms of the American Rescue Plan. As I've said many times before, it's not an accident that the United States of America is leading the world by far when it comes to the economic recovery since the pandemic. That is because of actions this White House took along with a Democratic majority in Congress. We have to continue to get that word out. It is more difficult now than at any point in the last 70, 80 years to get people's attention and to keep that attention. So I think it just shows you we have to be even more repetitive than in a previous era.
There's been a lot of criticism of the Biden policies on immigration. A lot of members I've talked to on both sides of the aisle say they hear it from their constituents. Are you satisfied with what Biden has done administratively? Obviously, there was a bipartisan deal that fell apart in the Senate, mostly because former President Donald Trump did not want Congress to act on it, and the Republicans backed away. But that is an advantage Republicans have, and it's not just border states. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, look, the border issue is a real issue. Essentially, we've been dealing with a spike at the southern border really since 2005. That's when I recall this issue first really rising kind of to the top of the agenda. If you recall, that's when George W. Bush was attempting to work out a bipartisan deal with Ted Kennedy and with John McCain. It wasn't solved then. And so we've been dealing with this now really for 2 decades. It did not start with President Biden. So that is incorrect when Republicans push that narrative. That said, there is no question it is a very serious issue that needs to be dealt with. Now, the best way to deal with it would have been the legislation, the bipartisan legislation that was being worked on and that was being forwarded. You had conservative Republican James Lankford leading the charge on the Republican side. You had Republican leadership in the Senate for it. But then what happened is Donald Trump ordered his Republican lieutenants in Congress to kill it because Trump wanted the issue rather than solving the problem. And don't take my word for it. Mitt Romney, Mitch McConnell, and other Senate Republicans have flat out said in public exactly what I just said, that the reason why we don't have a bipartisan immigration bill signed into law today is because Trump did not want it and wanted to kill it. So I support the president doing whatever he can independent of Congress, knowing that unfortunately we don't have a majority of Republicans willing to work with us in good faith to attempt to solve this problem for the American people.
I was doing a TV spot with former Congressman Mick Mulvaney and former Chief of Staff of the White House, and he said this election's about 3 I's: inflation, Israel, and immigration. Obviously, that's from the Republican standpoint. Inflation is obviously a big issue. I pointed out, though, there's a big A word that wasn't in that those 3 words, and that's abortion. How much should Democrats be talking about abortion down the stretch of this election?
Well, I'm smiling because Mick is actually a very good friend. I was texting with him earlier. I always get a kick out of when he invokes my name, sometimes to, in a good-natured way, take a shot. But one of the brightest members was here. I probably did not agree with him on pretty much anything. Right. But it is a reminder that, as you pointed out before, we actually do have more bipartisan friendships and relationships on the Hill than people realize. The problem is that what gets covered, unfortunately, tends to be, the people who are saying the most incendiary or really hateful things. It just doesn't attract as much attention if you have a conservative Republican and proud Democrat actually saying, good things about one another. Now, continuing on this theme, I strongly disagree with what Mick Mulvaney said in terms of the three I's. I have no doubt that he wishes that's what the election
Right.
would be about. But as you pointed out, one of the major issues that will be, well, before we even project forward about 2024, we know that one of the major issues in just the last election in 2022 was abortion. Really, the dynamic changed in June of 2022 once the Dobbs decision came down. And since then, I have been struck by just how much the abortion issue has impacted election after election. In Pennsylvania, we won a Senate race by 4 to 5 points that was supposed to be 50-50. We won a governor's race by double digits. We shockingly won the majority in the state house for the first time since my first election in 2008. And no one saw that coming. And by far the biggest issue was the Dobbs decision and the Republican desire to have a national abortion ban. And let me be clear, I'm not engaging in hysteria. I genuinely 100% am convinced that if Donald Trump wins, that means probably there's a Republican trifecta in Washington, and that will mean a national abortion ban. I don't think there's really any doubt about that. The only people who deny that reality are the same people who are saying that Roe would never be overturned in the first place. So I wouldn't exactly, say that they have very high credibility on this issue. So I think that the fact that Republicans still don't have a good answer on abortion, they continue to still push very extreme, unpopular measures. I only think that it will hurt them, especially in states like Pennsylvania.
Last question, Congressman. It's such a charged political environment. We have the legal cases with Hunter Biden and Donald Trump. And obviously, we had January 6th. Are you concerned about violence around the election, whether it's before or afterward?
I continue to be concerned about violence. I experienced January 6th. If you had asked me in the months and years before that, did I ever think in the United States of America I would see a day like January 6th, I would have probably naively said no. Mm-hmm. The reality is, frankly, ever since Donald Trump has been on the scene, the number of threats and the overall vitriol has gone up exponentially. I have seen just in the last couple of years, the U.S. Capitol Police authorize some things that you never even would have thought about before Trump and before the sort of violent rhetoric that he too often engages in. So it is a real concern. And I got to tell you, it's not just me. When I'm abroad, I was recently at the 80th anniversary of D-Day in Normandy, an incredibly moving ceremony. I had the opportunity to speak to a number of D-Day veterans who are just remarkable people. I mean, they're all in their late 90s or even over 100 now. The level of concern among our allies about where the U.S. is headed when it comes to the erosion of democracy, when it comes to the rise of violence, politically motivated violence. People are concerned around the world about the future trajectory of the United States. And in my view, I believe Donald Trump in a close election will ultimately be defeated this November. And I think one of the major reasons why will be a number of independent and even center-right voters turn against electing someone as dangerous as Donald Trump.
Well, it's certainly looking like it's going to be a tight election in many races. We may not even know who controls the White House, the House and Senate for a few days. As you know, Congressman, the House sometimes can take a week or so in certain races. But let's all hope for no violence this fall. Thank you, Congressman Boyle, for joining us.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Congressman Boyle, and thank you to our viewers and to the 92nd Street Y for their collaboration. If you missed any portion of today's discussion, the full event video is available on thehill.com and the 92nd Street Y website. Thank you very much. I'm Bob Cusack. Have a great evening.